In this presentation, we're talking about perceptions of conflict. Chapter 2 of your textbook discusses 4 areas. First, there are your core assumptions. These are deeply rooted beliefs about conflict. Like, do you believe it's normal to have conflict in a relationship? Do you believe conflict is good or bad? Often, we don't know what our core assumptions are until we start intentionally exploring them, so it's okay if you don't have the answers. But the way you perceive conflict will be shaped by these core assumptions. A way to identify your core assumptions is to think about how you talk about conflict or the conflict metaphors you use. This is the second area in Chapter 2. A metaphor compares one thing to another. If you talk about a conflict like it's a battleground or a chess match or a roller coaster, these metaphors can help you understand how you perceive conflict. The third area in Chapter 2 is personal filters. We all have our own unique filters that shape how we see the world. Some people lean more optimistic, others are more pessimistic. Some people easily give others the benefit of the doubt, and others are much less trusting. Your own filters shape how you perceive conflict, and especially what role you play in conflict. Are you the good guy, the one who always gets blamed but is never at fault? Are you the victim, the heroine, the objective observer, the devil's advocate? You can tell a totally different story about the same exact situation depending on your personal filter. Finally, culture and gender influence how we perceive conflict. Our cultures powerfully shape what we expect to happen, what we think is normal, and how we believe men and women should behave and communicate. Therefore, our cultures influence how we perceive conflict. Today, I'll focus on 3 different dimensions that shape our perception of conflict, though these dimensions overlap with the areas your textbook explores. We'll talk about norms, which are expectations for behavior and communication. I'll talk about background systems, which are collections of core assumptions and beliefs that individuals tend to have about conflict. And finally, I'll talk about biases, which is more or less a different way to talk about our personal filters. The way you see the world will always be biased, but the more you're aware of it, the less biased you'll be. Norms are sometimes spoken but often unspoken rules that exist for how we are supposed to behave in a given situation. Norms change from situation to situation. They definitely also change from culture to culture. Think about what it is that you're supposed to do when you hear someone sneeze. In the United States, the norm is that you say, "bless you." Even if you don't know them, if you're standing in an elevator with someone and they sneeze, a lot of people will just say, "bless you." In other cultures, though, that is not the norm. And in fact, saying something when someone sneezes is considered very rude. You're pointing out that somebody's doing some disgusting bodily function. It's gross. Why would you point it out? So, norms are those unspoken rules, those things that we learn without even realizing that we're supposed to do, supposed to say in a given situation. Let's be clear that norms are unspoken rules for behavior. These are rules for what you say, what you do, how you act. These are not rules for how you feel, what you believe, or what you think. For example, it's okay to feel angry at someone for sneezing in the elevator. There are no rules against thinking, "this lady is spreading all her nasty germs, now I'm going to get sick and it's all her fault." But the norms dictate that you keep your anger in check and that you keep those thoughts to yourself. Even though there are no norms for the emotions you feel and the thoughts you have, there are norms for how you express those emotions and how you share those thoughts. In other words, you can have all the feelings and thoughts you want, but when it comes to communicating those thoughts and feelings, there are norms for how you ought to do that. Conflict norms are the norms that exist specifically for conflict. Initiating or starting a conflict, managing the conflict, and resolving the conflict are all shaped by collective social expectations, or in other words, conflict norms. There are social rules for whether or not to initiate conflict, when to initiate conflict, how to initiate conflict, where to initiate it, and so on. For example, if you realize that you and another party have incompatible goals, what should you do? Well, what are the norms for this situation? If you're a contestant on the reality show Love Island, there's an unspoken rule, a conflict norm, that you should, and I quote, pull them for a chat. In other words, you should initiate a private, one-on-one conversation with them to tell them how you feel and how they're interfering with your attempts to accomplish your goals. You'll see in the images here that there's also a normative location for these chats, although fans of the show will also know that the bench swing and fire pit area are also common locations. Conflict management, the process of actually dealing with or handling the conflict, also has plenty of norms. Should you share your emotions? Should you tell the person your interests, that is, the underlying reason for your goals? Should you get straight to the point of the issue or talk about all the things you have in common first? Even conflict resolution, or the end result of a conflict, can be affected by norms. Does the person with more power or status have to win or have to appear to win? Do you have to find a middle ground so that there's never actually a winner and a loser? All of these conflict norms are expectations for behavior. Remember that there are no norms for how you actually feel. Norms are the unspoken rules for behaviors, the visible things that you do, especially in public. The same goes for conflict norms. Norms for how to manage conflict also differ by culture. So, for example, how much we express our emotions and how much we are expected to express our emotions is absolutely culturally bound. On one end of the spectrum, we have examples like cultures in South America and many Middle Eastern cultures, which very much value the honest expression of emotion. If I'm sad, I'm going to tell people that I'm sad. If I'm angry, I'm going to express that anger openly and honestly. On the other side of the spectrum, we have certain Asian cultures like Japanese and Korean cultures, and many African cultures as well, which sort of associate this raw emotional expression with a lack of maturity. And so someone who expresses emotions so openly and honestly is seen as very childish and very inappropriate. So different cultures have very different norms for how to behave generally, and also different norms for how to behave during a conflict, whether or not we bring up that conflict, how we bring it up, to whom we bring it up, and so forth. But of course, conflict norms also vary by circumstances. The way that you manage a conflict with your boss in the workplace is going to be different from the way that you manage a conflict with your mom in your home. Even though both of these people have power over you, right, and are an authority figure, so the power dynamics are the same, the way that you're supposed to deal with that conflict in those two circumstances is quite different. So norms vary by individual, but they also vary by culture, and they also vary based on the circumstances. Much like other norms, the norms that we have for managing conflict come from somewhere. So, for instance, the norm of when you walk into an elevator, you turn around and face the doors and don't make eye contact with anyone in the elevator, that's a norm that you learned as you grew up. It's possible that your parents sat you down and told you, listen, honey, this is what we do in elevators. But chances are you just looked around and watched what everybody did, and then you did the same thing. Your norms for managing conflict are the same. Chances are your parents did not sit you down and say, honey, this is what we do when we have conflict with someone. Although if your parents did and they then provided you with a healthy strategy for managing conflict, props to them. But most of us, when we're growing up in a household and we learn how to manage conflict based on our observations. We observe those around us and we say, okay, when mom and dad disagree, this is what they do. When my sibling and I don't get along, this is what we do. And these are the consequences for that, right? If me and my sibling, we don't agree and we start fighting and pulling our hair and punching, and then our parents say, that's not okay, you cannot do that. Then we'll learn, right, that that is not the norm. That is not the appropriate behavior for this circumstance. However, if you and your sibling disagree and you hit each other and you yell at each other and you pull each other's hair and your parents say, oh, they'll figure it out, then you learn, oh, this is the way to manage conflict. This is the sanctioned or the non-sanctioned, the appropriate way of doing things. So the feedback that we get based on our behavior and the behavior that we observe others doing turns into our background system, our ideas for how conflict ought to be managed. Let's talk more about these background systems. Based on our family histories, our experiences, our past, we form systems for interpreting, handling, managing conflict. Research has consistently found that there are three kind of broad categories that we can sort people into for how they perceive conflict. Now, each individual person may not fit perfectly into one of these three categories, but these tend to be, generally speaking, the way that we organize, the way that people see, perceive, understand, expect conflict. So if you're listening to these or reading about these and thinking, well, none of these really describes me, you might say, I'm a little bit of this and a little bit of that. That's absolutely possible. But let's go ahead and define these three categories. So these are background systems. They're essentially clusters of norms, of beliefs, of attitudes about conflict. So if you believe that conflict is inherently a bad thing, a dangerous thing, a thing that hurts relationships, something that we really should try to avoid, we should really try to ignore, then you probably have an avoidant background system. Usually people who have avoidant background systems have this similar set of beliefs about what conflict is, the values that are associated with conflict, and the kind of expected behaviors that surround conflict. And so people who have avoidant background systems for conflict tend to avoid conflict. The next background system is this collaborative system, and people who have this background system tend to see conflict as more like an opportunity, as more like something that we can use to better understand our issues, that conflict is good, actually. We just have to kind of work our way through it, and it's actually a really helpful, constructive, normal part of life. And so people with this background system are going to approach conflict in a very different way than people who have an avoidant background system. The last background system that your textbook describes is the aggressive/coercive background system. I prefer to differentiate these two systems, although research consistently shows that they kind of fit in with one another, but I want to differentiate between these two words. Having an aggressive conflict system means that you see conflict as kind of an opportunity for dominance or power. So the person who wins the conflict has more power. This is actually a belief that happens that exists for people who have both an aggressive and a coercive system. But people who have an aggressive system tend to behave in more overtly aggressive ways. So if somebody has an aggressive background system, they're likely to say, hey, I disagree. Here's why I'm right? And kind of like shove it in your face. They might yell. They might really talk about it very overtly. They are going to be very direct about the conflicts that they have because they believe that they have to kind of exert this dominance in order to maintain or gain power in the relationship, right? It tends to be about power. People who have a coercive background system tend to use more covert tactics. So they tend to engage in tacit conflict, right? If you don't remember what tacit conflict is, go back to Module 1 in our definitions of conflict. But tacit conflict is that kind of more under the radar kind of behavior. And so they tend to use more covert, kind of subtle, hidden, behind the scenes methods. Because although for them, conflict is also a power struggle, it's also about maintaining face, about kind of looking like you're in control. And if you scream and yell, well, you have lost control, buddy. Whereas if you kind of remain calm and use more subtle tactics, you are maintaining the upper hand, right? And that is that coercive system. In either case, it's usually about power. People with aggressive or coercive background systems really see conflict as a battleground for power dynamics. Who has the most power? Who's in charge? Who is the dominant one here? And conflict is an opportunity to determine this. For some, they they might see themselves as always the loser. Others might really perceive themselves as the winner. But in either case, people with this aggressive or coercive background system perceive conflict as a site for power battles. Okay, so we have these three different background systems, which each background system is really a collection of norms, of beliefs, of attitudes about what conflict is and what we're supposed to do or what we ought to do during conflict. It's important to remember that these background systems are really just collections of beliefs and norms. So people with collaborative background systems all tend to believe the same things about conflict and all tend to have the same norms for what it is that we're supposed to do when conflict arises or what it is we're supposed to do when we disagree with someone. If you sit down and make a list of all of the things that you believe to be true about conflict, if you go ahead and describe conflict to yourself, and if you try to explain what it is that you're supposed to do during conflict and you make that list, it should become pretty clear to you what your background system is. If you think that conflict is an opportunity, if you think that the best way to manage conflict is by sitting down and talking it out and being honest, but being respectful of the other person's emotions and feelings, then you've probably got a collaborative background system. If you think of conflict as something that's dangerous, that can be detrimental to relationships, that's really only going to hurt, that healthy, happy relationships don't have conflict, that the best thing to do when conflict arises is to try to shove it under the rug and not talk about it because dealing with it is just going to cause trouble, then you've probably got an avoidant background system. If you think that when conflict shows up, you had better voice your opinion and you had better be heard and people had better respect you, if you believe that conflict is a time to really kind of demonstrate your authority or your power, if you believe that conflict is a win-lose sort of situation, no matter what happens, there's going to be a winner and there's going to be a loser, you've probably got an aggressive or coercive background system. So these background systems are these ideas, these perceptions that exist in the backs of our minds and that shape the way that we perceive conflict. That means that if two people are having conflict and they have very different background systems, they're going to be perceiving the same exact situation in very, very different ways. We're going to talk more about this two people coming together with different background systems, when we talk about marriage and when we talk about conflict management styles specifically in marriage. But know that coming from different background systems can itself create conflict. Another way of studying perceptions about conflict is to look at metaphors. Three authors, Busnell, Burrell, and McMillan, studied the metaphors that women in government use when describing conflict. So what they did was they offered a free conflict management training to women in government positions to recruit these participants. They had almost 60 participants, and before they started the training, they asked, what is conflict like with your coworkers, your department members, your supervisors, and generally, what is conflict like? Now, everybody who participated gave their own personal answer, and they gave their own metaphor. So some people said, conflict with my boss is like pounding against a brick wall. Or some people might have said, conflict with my coworker is like having a pleasant conversation, right? So they described conflict in their own words. So then what the researchers did was they looked at everybody's answers and they tried to kind of categorize them, to put them into consistent categories and say, okay, all of these answers are really similar. Even though they're using totally different words or different specific metaphors, they tend to be falling under kind of an umbrella category. And they found 3 big umbrella categories or metaphor families. The first most common metaphor was that of war or destruction. So the women were describing this battle that came at a great personal cost, much like war. They used words like pain, loss, battle, danger, and even death. When they were describing conflict, there was this sense of destruction and impending doom. So these descriptions, the authors decided the best way to kind of categorize all of these is to call it conflict is like war or destruction. The next most common kind of umbrella category that they identified, they called impotence or inequality. And they named this because they were when they were listening to women's descriptions, these women were saying they had little to no input in these conflicts. So whereas the description of war was a win-lose sort of situation, when women were describing this kind of conflict, this impotence conflict, they were saying that they were always the loser, no matter what. They used words like being a puppet, being powerless, engaging in a losing proposition. And so they were really describing a total lack of power, a total inability to make any change, this sense of impotence. The last category that the researchers identified was by far the smallest. Very few people described conflict in this way, and actually the purpose of their training was to get more people to see conflict in this third way, and that is conflict as an opportunity. And so they did have a few women who described the potentially collaborative experience of conflict. They used words like discussion, opportunity, or analyzing the alternatives as ways that they perceived conflict. So in this first study, the researchers really identified these 3 different families of metaphors. They noticed many specific metaphors, but what they were really looking for were what are the big pictures? And you can see these kind of having some similarities with our background systems. If you feel completely impotent and conflict, then what is the point in engaging? And you're likely to be avoidant. If you see conflict as an opportunity, then you're more likely to kind of have this collaborative background system. But if conflict is about war, then you're going to have a more coercive or aggressive background system where you're getting ready for battle and you've really got to emerge as the winner. So you see these themes, these kind of broad categories of how people perceive conflict coming through in different forms of research, but it seems to be a consistent pattern. If you're thinking, oh, that study was only done with women, I bet if we do this study with men, we'll get different results. Well, Burrell and Buzzanel thought the same thing, and so a few years later, in 1997, they published this study in which they did more or less the same thing, but this time with both men and women. And wouldn't you know it, the results are exactly the same. It turns out that men and women are really not that different in how they perceive conflict. Gender does sometimes influence conflict, but a whole lot less than you would expect. And in fact, we'll talk a little bit more about this later on. The way that gender affects conflict is because we expect it to affect conflict. It's not because you're a man or a woman that you're going to manage conflict differently. It's because the person you're having the conflict with is a man or a woman. And so therefore you manage the conflict differently because of your expectations of the other person based on their gender, not because of your own gender. So it turns out that men and women actually perceive conflict in exactly the same way. When they asked men and women what their metaphors were for conflict, the exact same 3 came up. Although this time they simplified the names of these umbrella terms for the metaphors, and they just called them war, impotence, and then the last one they renamed to a rational process. This kind of opportunity for resolution they named a rational process. And what they found was that impotence was actually the most common metaphor that people used for conflict in the workplace, followed closely by war, and then again, the distant third was this rational process. They found no sex differences, so men and women were not more likely or less likely to choose a different type of metaphor. Men and women used the exact same kinds of metaphors, but they did notice some context differences. They noticed that conflict with a supervisor was more likely to be seen as a rational process and less likely to be seen as impotence. So that's a good news. That means that these people that they were doing the research with had bosses who kind of provided opportunity when it came to conflict. And then the other difference was that with departmental members, so not necessarily coworkers, but people you work with but that you're less close with, we saw much more use of the metaphor of impotence, and we saw less of the metaphor of war. So in this case, when there are people in the organization, kind of in a department somewhere, this sense is that I'm never going to get my way, things are never going to change, conflict is pointless. So the person that you're having conflict with is going to affect how you perceive conflict, but your own gender does not impact your perception of conflict. So these metaphors really help us to understand how people perceive conflict. Another way in which perception shapes conflict is the perceptions that we have about our own behaviors and about the behaviors of others that we're involved in the conflict with. So there is this kind of conflict equation where my perception of a specific conflict involves my perception of the communicative acts or the behaviors that each person is doing, the meanings that are attached to those behaviors, or in other words, the attributions that I have for those behaviors, as well as the attributions for the relationships or the meanings that I've attached to that relationship. So during conflict, we attribute meanings to our behaviors and the other's behaviors. And the meanings that we attribute to those can really shape the way we perceive that conflict. So I've included a quote here by an actress and author who created a TV show called Pen 15, which is a comedy you may enjoy. And she describes her middle and high school experience as being really painful and awful. And when she talks to people whom she went to school with, they have a very different perception. They say, well, you seemed so happy. Everybody liked you. You liked everyone. You seemed so positive and optimistic. And when she thinks back, she remembers being excluded or singled out or pointed out as different. And she relates this experience to racism, where she says that they liked me for an Asian. right? And so this experience made her absolutely feel excluded, but her classmates did not even realize that this is what they were doing. And so their perceptions were that there was no conflict, whereas for her, there absolutely was a conflict, and she was being excluded and cast out. So there are very different attributions going on for the exact same behavior. These two parties are perceiving the same situation through very different eyes and making very different attributions. Your textbook makes a really important distinction between intent and impact, what I intended to do and how it actually came off. And so we're going to talk a little bit about attributions in terms of impact and intent. If I say, I didn't mean to be sexist when I told you to smile, what I'm saying is, well, I didn't mean to be sexist. My intent was not sexist. But what the other person might be telling me is that my impact was sexist and therefore hurtful. We tend to place meaning on our intent, but on others' impact. So if somebody says that I hurt them, I'm going to say, but I didn't mean to hurt you. But when we talk to other people, we tend to focus on, well, here's what the consequences of your behavior was. I don't really care that you didn't mean to hurt me. You did hurt me. This kind of clash between where we place meaning on us versus how we place meaning on others is called the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error happens when we attribute our behavior to external factors and others' behavior to internal dispositions. In other words, if I make a mistake, I didn't mean to. It was because of the circumstances. The guy driving in front of me was driving like a lunatic, and that's why I had to brake all of a sudden. But when I look at somebody else's behavior and they break all of a sudden, I say, you're a jerk. You're a bad person. It's not that you're having a bad day. It's not that the circumstances are making you drive badly. It's that you yourself are a bad driver. And not only are you a bad driver, you're an inconsiderate jerk, right? I'm going straight to criticism. And potentially even contempt here, right? When I'm using name calling. So this fundamental attribution error means that we give ourselves lots of leeway, but we don't do the same for others. Keeping this in mind helps us be a bit more critical of ourselves, right? And to being cautious of how we are being perceived, and to hopefully be a little bit more lenient on others. And remember that other people might be having a bad day, that maybe the circumstances are what's causing their particular behavior in this case. We've got to focus on others' intent and our impact, as well as our intent and others' impact. I say it's important to consider both intent and impact, but other people are really going to focus on your impact. If you hurt them, it doesn't matter that you didn't mean to hurt them. If you've hurt their feelings, that is what they're going to focus on. They're going to focus on the impact. But it's important to know that intent and impact, although they're different, they are connected. There was a study published by Ames and Fiske in 2013, and what they did was they kind of had participants read a little scenario, a vignette, if you will, about a CEO of a small company, where employees' compensation was partially based on company profits. The CEO made an investment that performed poorly and therefore cost his employees money. The participants were randomly assigned to either the intentional harm condition, where the CEO had done this on purpose, had taken a risk and sort of didn't care, or the unintentional harm condition, where the CEO had tried to do his best, but he ended up losing the money and that was not his intent. So that was the only difference that we saw in these two different scenarios. What happened was that people who thought that the CEO had done this intentionally, they thought that the bad thing was worse, right? That the fact that the people at this company had lost money was way more harmful. Then the people who got the scenario where the money lost was an accident or was unintentional. And you can see those two bars. They kind of did this story twice with slightly different circumstances. And in both cases, the intentional harm was seen as more harmful than the unintentional harm. So the intent and impact are related. If you hurt someone by accident, they're going to see it as less harmful, less hurtful than if you do it on purpose. So intent and impact are absolutely connected, but it is important to remember that people who are not you are going to be much more focused on your impact than they are your intent, even if your intent is good. Remember that the definition of conflict includes the word perceived, or perceived incompatible goals, or perceived scarce resources, perceived interference. Perception plays such a huge role in conflict, so we want to be aware of this. Our background systems, in other words, how we perceive conflict, our metaphors, our biases, how we perceive people, all of those shape our perceptions of conflict, but they also shape how we behave during conflict. Do your best when you're experiencing a conflict to become more aware of those perceptions and how your background systems, your metaphors, your biases might be influencing your perception of this conflict. How perhaps if you made some little mental changes, you might perceive this conflict in a new light and you might be able to manage it differently. Be careful of that fundamental attribution error. Be careful of saying, I'm right and they're wrong. Because often they are perceiving the exact opposite. And chances are you're both right and you're also both wrong. Be cautious and be conscientious of your perceptions. And that's a great first step towards managing conflict in a more open and healthy way.